There's a phenomenon that therapists see every day, relationship coaches witness repeatedly, and friends observe with growing concern. Brilliant, accomplished, beautiful women finding themselves inexplicably drawn to men who seem incapable of loving them back. These aren't weak women or naive girls. These are doctors, lawyers, entrepreneurs, artists, teachers, women who excel in every other area of their lives, yet find themselves trapped in cycles of emotional unavailability that defy logic. You've seen it happen. Maybe you've lived it. The woman who has everything together professionally, who makes sound decisions in business, who friends turn to for advice, suddenly becomes unrecognizable when she meets a certain type of man. She starts making excuses, rearranging her priorities, accepting crumbs of attention while giving her whole heart in return. The question isn't whether this happens. We all know it does. The question is why. Why do capable women find themselves magnetically pulled toward men who withhold love? Why does emotional distance create desire instead of disinterest? And perhaps most importantly, what invisible forces are at play that make unavailability feel more attractive than genuine affection? This isn't a story about weakness or poor judgment. This is about human psychology, attachment theory, and the complex interplay between our conscious desires and unconscious patterns. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about attraction, love, and the hidden mechanisms that drive human connection.
The psychology behind attraction to unavailable partners operates on principles that seem to contradict common sense, yet are deeply rooted in how our brains process reward and attachment. When we examine this phenomenon through a scientific lens, patterns emerge that explain why emotional distance can feel more compelling than emotional availability. The human brain is wired to pay attention to intermittent reinforcement more than consistent reward. This principle, first discovered in behavioral psychology experiments, reveals why slot machines are addictive, while steady paychecks, though more valuable, don't create the same psychological intensity. When someone's attention and affection come sporadically, unpredictably, the brain's reward system becomes hyperactivated, constantly seeking the next hit of validation. In relationships, this translates to a cruel irony. The person who texts back immediately every time becomes predictable, while the person who responds sporadically becomes fascinating. The brain interprets this unpredictability as a sign that the reward is valuable and rare, triggering an obsessive focus that feels like intense attraction, but is actually a neurochemical response to uncertainty. Women who find themselves drawn to unavailable men aren't responding to the men themselves as much as they're responding to the emotional state these men create. The anxiety, the anticipation, the relief when contact finally comes, the crash when it doesn't. This emotional roller coaster produces a cocktail of stress hormones and feel-good chemicals that can become physiologically addictive. The unavailable man doesn't have to be particularly special or exceptional. He simply has to master the art of intermittent reinforcement, whether consciously or unconsciously. He gives just enough attention to keep hope alive, but withdraws just often enough to create longing. He shares just enough vulnerability to suggest depth, but remains mysterious enough to fuel imagination. This pattern explains why women often describe these relationships as having incredible chemistry or feeling unlike anything else. What they're experiencing isn't necessarily a deeper connection, it's a heightened neurochemical state created by uncertainty and intermittent reward. The intensity feels meaningful, but is actually the brain's response to unpredictable stimuli. Understanding this mechanism is crucial because it reveals that the attraction isn't based on compatibility, shared values, or genuine connection. It's based on the psychological principles that govern addiction, gambling, and other behaviors driven by intermittent reinforcement. The sooner women recognize this pattern, the sooner they can distinguish between authentic attraction and neurochemical manipulation. To understand why some women are more susceptible to unavailable partners than others, we must examine the attachment patterns formed in earliest childhood. These patterns, established before conscious memory, create templates that unconsciously guide adult relationship choices. The connection between childhood attachment and adult romantic patterns isn't just theory. It's supported by decades of psychological research and observable in therapeutic settings worldwide. Children who experience inconsistent caregiving, love that comes with conditions, attention that must be earned, affection that appears and disappears unpredictably, develop what psychologists call anxious attachment. These children learn that love is something to be chased, won, and maintained through perfect behavior. They become hypervigilant to signs of withdrawal, expertly attuned to the moods and needs of others, and convinced that love requires constant effort to maintain. Fast forward to adulthood, and these attachment patterns become the unconscious criteria for romantic attraction. The woman who learned to chase her father's approval when he was distant may find herself irresistibly drawn to men who require the same emotional labor. The girl whose mother's love was conditional on performance may seek partners who make her feel like she must constantly prove her worth. This isn't conscious choice, it's pattern recognition at a neural level. The unavailable man feels familiar, not because he's right, but because he activates the same emotional circuitry that was wired in childhood. Her nervous system recognizes the dynamic. Someone important is pulling away, which means she must work harder to secure their love. This recognition feels like compatibility, but it's actually trauma repetition. The cruel irony is that women with anxious attachment often describe unavailable men as challenging or complex in positive terms. They interpret emotional distance as depth, inconsistency as mystery, and the need to chase as evidence of passion. Meanwhile, available men who offer consistent affection feel boring or too easy because they don't activate the familiar pattern of having to earn love. These childhood blueprints also explain why logic rarely overrides attraction in these situations. When someone asks, "Why don't you just leave him and find someone who treats you better?" they're asking the conscious mind to override programming that exists at a much deeper pre-conscious level. It's like asking someone to consciously control their heartbeat. The system operates automatically below the threshold of conscious control. Breaking these patterns requires more than just understanding them intellectually. It requires rewiring the neural pathways that equate love with struggle, worth with achievement, and connection with chaos. This process is possible, but it demands recognizing that the attraction to unavailable partners isn't about the partners themselves, it's about unfinished business from the past seeking resolution in the present.
One of the most compelling dynamics that keeps women attached to unavailable men is the rescue fantasy. The unconscious belief that the right woman can heal, fix, or transform a damaged man through the power of her love. This fantasy operates on multiple psychological levels, appealing to both nurturing instincts and ego needs in ways that can feel profoundly meaningful while being ultimately destructive. The rescue fantasy often begins with glimpses of vulnerability. The emotionally unavailable man shares fragments of his past pain, his childhood wounds, his previous betrayals. He doesn't share these stories seeking healing or growth. He shares them as explanations for his current behavior, as reasons why he can't fully commit or love completely. But to the woman caught in the rescue fantasy, these revelations feel like invitations, like secret knowledge that makes her special and chosen. She begins to see herself as the exception, the one woman who truly understands him, the person who can provide what no one else could. This belief is intoxicating because it makes her feel uniquely powerful and needed. If she can be the one to break through his walls, to heal his wounds, to inspire him to change, then she must possess extraordinary worth and capability. The rescue fantasy feeds both her desire to be helpful and her need to feel exceptional. The psychology behind this pattern often traces back to childhood experiences where love was earned through caretaking. Perhaps she was the family peacemaker, the one who managed everyone's emotions, the child who learned that her value came through making others feel better. The unavailable man presents the ultimate caretaking challenge, promising the ultimate validation if she succeeds.
But here's the psychological trap. The rescue fantasy requires the man to remain broken enough to need rescuing, yet healed enough to eventually choose her. This creates an impossible contradiction. If he truly heals and becomes emotionally available, he might choose someone else, someone who didn't have to work so hard to earn his love. If he remains broken, she never gets the love she's working toward. Either way, she's trapped in a dynamic that can never truly succeed. The rescue fantasy also provides a convenient explanation for the relationship's problems. When he's distant, it's because of his past trauma. When he's inconsistent, it's because he's protecting himself from being hurt again. When he won't commit, it's because previous women have betrayed his trust. Every problematic behavior becomes evidence of his woundedness rather than his character. And her job becomes healing those wounds rather than protecting herself from their impact. This dynamic can persist for years because small moments of openness or vulnerability feel like progress. When he shares a childhood memory, lets his guard down during intimacy, or shows moments of genuine affection, she interprets these as signs that her love is working, that he's beginning to heal, that she's succeeding where others have failed. These moments provide just enough reinforcement to fuel years of hopeful waiting and emotional investment. The most painful aspect of the rescue fantasy is that it prevents authentic connection. She falls in love with his potential rather than his reality, with who she believes he could become rather than who he actually is. Meanwhile, he never has to face the real consequences of his unavailability because she's always making excuses, always providing second chances, always believing that tomorrow he'll be ready to love her the way she deserves.
One of the most confusing aspects of attraction to unavailable partners is how their very unavailability gets interpreted as evidence of depth, complexity, and authenticity. This misinterpretation isn't random. It's the result of cultural narratives about love and specific psychological mechanisms that make mystery feel more compelling than transparency. Society has long romanticized the idea of the tortured soul, the broken hero, the man with mysterious depths that only the right woman can unlock. From classic literature to modern films, we're fed stories where the most compelling male characters are those who are hardest to reach, most difficult to understand, and most resistant to love. These cultural scripts teach women to interpret emotional distance not as a limitation, but as evidence of hidden depth waiting to be discovered. The unavailable man unconsciously leverages this narrative. His silences aren't uncomfortable pauses, they're mysterious depths. His inability to express emotions isn't a limitation, it's complex inner turmoil. His inconsistent behavior isn't confusing, it's evidence of his struggle with feelings too powerful to express. Every sign of emotional limitation gets reframed as proof of emotional profundity. This reframing is aided by the psychological principle that our brains are pattern-seeking machines that hate ambiguity. When someone's behavior is inconsistent or unclear, our minds automatically work to create a coherent narrative that explains their actions. In the case of the unavailable man, the most psychologically satisfying explanation is often that he's protecting deep emotions, that his distance represents the magnitude of what he feels, that his inability to commit reflects the intensity of his inner experience. The truly available man, by contrast, can seem almost boringly straightforward. He says what he means what he says, and his emotions are accessible and consistent. There's no mystery to solve, no complex inner world to decode, no hidden depths to discover. His transparency, which should be refreshing, instead feels somehow less sophisticated than the unavailable man's complications. This perception is reinforced by the different ways these two types of men present themselves. The unavailable man often cultivates an air of mystery. He shares selected fragments of his past, hints at experiences too profound to fully express, and maintains an emotional reserve that suggests hidden depths. The available man, secure in himself and his emotions, sees no need for such performance. He presents himself authentically, which can paradoxically seem less interesting to women conditioned to equate emotional complexity with depth. The confusion deepens because unavailable men often do possess certain types of depth. They may be introspective, artistic, philosophically inclined, or emotionally complex. But these qualities exist alongside, not because of, their unavailability. A man can be deep, creative, and thoughtful while also being emotionally accessible and relationally capable. However, when depth and unavailability appear in the same person, it's easy to assume they're connected, that one causes the other. What women often discover, sometimes years into these relationships, is that emotional unavailability isn't depth, it's limitation. The man who can't express his feelings isn't harboring profound emotions too complex for words, he's simply limited in his emotional vocabulary and capacity. The man who can't commit isn't protecting a love too powerful to risk, he's protecting himself from the vulnerability that real intimacy requires. The mystery isn't evidence of fascinating inner complexity, it's evidence of emotional underdevelopment disguised as sophistication. Recognizing this distinction is crucial for women who want to build genuinely deep, meaningful relationships. True depth comes from emotional intelligence, self-awareness, and the courage to be vulnerable. It's found in men who can articulate their feelings, who face their fears rather than being controlled by them, and who choose intimacy despite its risks. The capacity for real depth requires emotional availability, not its absence.
Perhaps no aspect of attraction to unavailable men is more intoxicating than the fantasy of being chosen by someone who chooses no one. When a woman believes she might be the exception to a man's pattern of emotional distance, the psychological reward feels exponentially more valuable than being chosen by someone who chooses easily. This dynamic taps into fundamental human needs for specialness and significance in ways that can override rational judgment. The psychology behind this attraction is rooted in scarcity principle, the economic and psychological concept that rare things feel more valuable than abundant things. A man who is emotionally available to many women feels less special to pursue than a man who appears emotionally available to none. If she can be the one who breaks through his barriers, who earns his trust, who receives the love he withholds from others, then she must be extraordinarily special. This dynamic is particularly powerful for women who struggle with feelings of ordinariness or who need external validation to feel worthy. Being chosen by the choosy man would prove definitively that she possesses something unique and valuable. It would answer the deep question of, am I enough, with a resounding yes, validated by someone whose selectivity makes his choice meaningful. The unavailable man, whether consciously or unconsciously, often cultivates this dynamic by sharing selective pieces of information about his romantic history. He mentions how he's never felt this way before, how he doesn't usually open up to women, how he's surprised by his own feelings for her. These statements, whether true or not, create the impression that his interest in her represents a departure from his usual pattern, making her feel chosen and special. The cruel irony is that the unavailable man's selectivity isn't actually about choosing higher quality partners, it's about avoiding real intimacy altogether. He doesn't choose no one because he has impossibly high standards. He chooses no one because choosing someone would require vulnerability, commitment, and emotional risk he's not prepared to take. His unavailability isn't evidence of selectivity, it's evidence of limitation. But the woman caught in this dynamic interprets his unavailability as a challenge to overcome rather than a limitation to accept. She sees his emotional distance as a wall to scale rather than a boundary to respect. The more unavailable he is, the more special she would feel if she could make him available. The pursuit becomes about proving her worth rather than finding genuine compatibility. This pattern explains why women often work harder for unavailable men than they would for available ones. With an available man,
Being chosen feels nice, but not necessarily significant. After all, he chooses people. But with an unavailable man, being chosen would feel like winning the emotional lottery, like achieving something most women can't achieve. The effort feels justified by the potential magnitude of the reward. The fantasy is sustained by small moments that feel like progress, a vulnerable conversation, an unusually affectionate text, a moment of seeming openness. Each of these incidents feels like evidence that she's succeeding where others have failed, that she's slowly earning the love that he withholds from everyone else. These moments provide just enough reinforcement to fuel continued hope and effort. What makes this dynamic particularly painful is that even if the unavailable man eventually does choose her, commits to a relationship, moves in together, or even marries her, the underlying unavailability often remains. The choosing wasn't really about her specialness, it was about his readiness to take that step with whoever happened to be there when he was ready. And because his availability was never really about her, it can be withdrawn just as arbitrarily as it was granted. The healthiest relationships are built on the reality of being chosen by someone who chooses consciously, deliberately, and consistently. A man who is emotionally available doesn't make you feel special because you're the exception to his pattern. He makes you feel special because he sees your actual worth and chooses to celebrate it every day.
After months or years of emotional roller coasters, drama, and uncertainty, many women find themselves in a peculiar psychological position. When they finally encounter genuine peace in a relationship, it feels wrong, boring, or somehow insufficient. This isn't a character flaw or evidence of being addicted to drama. It's a predictable response to nervous system conditioning that has profound implications for recognizing healthy love. The human nervous system is remarkably adaptable, calibrating what feels normal based on repeated experiences. A woman who has spent months or years in a state of hypervigilance, constantly monitoring texts, reading between lines, analyzing behavior, waiting for the other shoe to drop, has trained her nervous system to expect and even seek out signs of threat or instability. In this heightened state, crisis feels familiar and calm feels foreign. When someone's nervous system has been conditioned to high-stress relating, the absence of stress doesn't register as relief, it registers as boredom or emptiness. The steady, reliable man who texts back consistently, who shows up when he says he will, who doesn't create emotional emergencies, can feel almost anticlimactic compared to the man who keeps her nervous system activated with uncertainty and intermittent reinforcement. This conditioning explains why women often describe healthy relationships as lacking chemistry or spark. What they're interpreting as chemistry is actually the neurochemical cocktail produced by stress, anxiety, and intermittent reward. The adrenaline rush of not knowing where you stand, the dopamine hit when he finally responds after hours of silence, the cortisol spike when he seems to be pulling away. These stress chemicals can create a feeling of intensity that gets mistaken for passion. Meanwhile, the steady flow of oxytocin and endorphins produced by secure, consistent love feels different, calmer, more subtle, less dramatic. To a nervous system accustomed to emotional chaos, this biochemical peace can feel like numbness or disconnection. The woman might worry that she's not in love because she's not constantly anxious about the relationship's status. This misinterpretation of peace as boredom can lead to self-sabotaging behaviors. Some women find themselves picking fights with stable partners, creating unnecessary drama, or even ending healthy relationships because they feel too comfortable or too easy. Others might maintain stable relationships while fantasizing about or seeking out the intensity they remember from dysfunctional ones. The cultural narrative around love often reinforces these misinterpretations. We're told that real love is all-consuming, that it should feel like can't eat, can't sleep intensity, that peaceful love is somehow less romantic or passionate than turbulent love. Movies and novels rarely celebrate the quiet joy of knowing someone will be there tomorrow, choosing instead to romanticize the drama of not knowing where you stand. Breaking this pattern requires understanding that peaceful love isn't the absence of feeling, it's the presence of sustainable, nourishing emotion. The man who brings stability to your nervous system isn't boring. He's creating space for deeper forms of intimacy that aren't possible when you're in constant fight or flight mode. When you're not spending emotional energy managing relationship crises, that energy becomes available for growth, creativity, and genuine connection. Retraining the nervous system to accept and appreciate peace is a gradual process that requires conscious effort. It means recognizing that the absence of anxiety isn't the absence of love, that predictability isn't the enemy of passion, and that someone who doesn't activate your trauma responses isn't necessarily wrong for you. It means learning to value the man who makes you feel safe enough to sleep peacefully, who creates stability rather than chaos, and who loves you in ways that heal rather than harm. The ultimate irony is that once a woman learns to recognize and value peaceful love, she often discovers it contains far more genuine passion and intimacy than the chaotic relationships she previously sought. When you're not constantly managing emotional crises, that emotional energy becomes available for growth, deeper levels of connection, and joy. The peace that once felt boring becomes the foundation for everything she actually wanted from love.
Escaping the cycle of attraction to unavailable partners isn't simply a matter of deciding to choose differently. It requires understanding and actively rewiring deep psychological patterns that operate largely outside conscious awareness. This process demands patience, self-compassion, and often professional support, but it's entirely possible for women who are ready to do the internal work required. The first step is developing awareness of the pattern itself. This means honestly examining past relationships and identifying the common threads, not just in the men she's chosen, but in her own responses to their behavior. Did she consistently work harder when they pulled away? Did she interpret their emotional distance as depth or complexity? Did she feel more attracted when she had to chase their attention? Recognition of these patterns is essential because you can't change what you don't acknowledge. Self-awareness must extend to understanding the emotional payoff of the pattern. As dysfunctional as these relationships are, they serve psychological needs: the need to feel special for being chosen by someone selective, the need to replay childhood dynamics in hopes of a different outcome, the need to prove worthiness through achievement in love. Until these underlying needs are addressed directly, women will continue gravitating toward situations that promise to meet them. One crucial aspect of breaking free is learning to distinguish between anxiety and attraction. Many women discover that what they've been calling butterflies or chemistry is actually their nervous system's response to uncertainty and potential threat. Learning to recognize the physical sensations of anxiety, the racing heart, the obsessive thinking, the hypervigilance, and understanding that these aren't signs of love, but signs of activation is transformational. Simultaneously, women must learn to recognize and tolerate the feeling of genuine safety in relationships. This often requires consciously appreciating men who are consistent, reliable, and emotionally transparent, qualities that might initially feel boring, but are actually the foundation of sustainable love. It means learning to value being chosen by someone who chooses consciously, rather than someone who barely chooses at all. The process often involves grieving the fantasy of being the exception, the one who could change him, the woman whose love was powerful enough to heal his wounds. This grief is real and necessary because letting go of these fantasies means releasing a version of herself that felt special and powerful, even if that power was ultimately illusory. Therapeutic support can be invaluable during this process, particularly approaches that address both the conscious patterns and the unconscious attachment styles that drive them. EMDR, somatic therapy, and attachment-focused therapeutic approaches can help process the childhood experiences that created these patterns in the first place. Perhaps most importantly, breaking free requires developing a different relationship with herself, one based on inherent worth rather than earned worth, on self-validation rather than external validation, on internal security rather than the security that comes from finally being chosen by someone who rarely chooses at all. This internal shift is often the most challenging part of the process because it requires taking responsibility for her own emotional well-being rather than hoping someone else will provide it. The journey isn't linear, and setbacks are normal. A woman might find herself attracted to unavailable partners even after understanding the pattern intellectually. The key is to have compassion for herself during this process, while continuing to make conscious choices that align with her genuine well-being rather than her familiar patterns.
The ultimate goal isn't just to avoid unavailable partners, but to recognize and attract genuinely healthy love, the kind that nourishes rather than depletes, that brings peace rather than chaos, and that supports growth rather than trauma repetition. Understanding what healthy love actually looks like is crucial, because it often differs dramatically from what women who've been caught in these patterns expect. Healthy love is characterized by consistency, not the boring kind of predictability, but the reliable kind of presence. It's knowing that someone's feelings for you aren't dependent on your performance, your mood, or your ability to chase them when they withdraw. It's the security of being with someone whose affection is steady rather than intermittent, whose attention doesn't need to be earned daily through perfect behavior. The man who offers healthy love doesn't create anxiety, he resolves it. Instead of leaving you guessing about his feelings, he expresses them clearly. Instead of making you work for his attention, he gives it freely. Instead of creating emotional emergencies that require your management, he handles his own emotions and supports you in handling yours. His presence in your life decreases rather than increases your stress levels. Healthy love also includes appropriate vulnerability, the willingness to be emotionally transparent without using that vulnerability as manipulation. The emotionally healthy man shares his feelings as information and connection, not as explanations for poor behavior or reasons why he can't fully commit. His vulnerability draws you closer rather than keeping you at arm's length. Perhaps most importantly, healthy love is growth-oriented. Instead of keeping you stuck in familiar patterns, it challenges you to become more of yourself. Instead of requiring you to shrink or perform to maintain the connection, it celebrates your authentic self and supports your expansion. The right partner doesn't just accept you as you are, he sees who you're becoming and supports that journey. Recognition of healthy love often requires retraining your emotional responses. The man who makes you feel peaceful rather than anxious might initially seem less exciting, but learning to appreciate that peace as a sign of safety rather than boredom is crucial. The man whose love is freely given rather than earned through struggle might initially seem less valuable, but recognizing the true worth of unconditional positive regard is transformational. Healthy love also includes healthy conflict resolution. Instead of dramatic fights followed by passionate reconciliations, there are honest conversations that actually resolve issues. Instead of walking on eggshells to avoid triggering withdrawal, there's the safety to express disagreement, knowing the relationship can handle it. Instead of make-up sex after emotional crises, there's ongoing intimacy that doesn't require drama to fuel it. For women recovering from patterns of unavailable partners, recognizing healthy love might initially feel anticlimactic. The absence of anxiety might feel like the absence of passion. The presence of stability might feel like the absence of excitement. Learning to reframe these experiences, seeing peace as the foundation for genuine passion, stability as the ground for real adventure, is essential for embracing the love that actually serves your highest good. The man worth choosing is the one who makes your life better by being in it, who adds to your peace rather than disrupting it, and who chooses you not because you've convinced him of your worth, but because he can see it clearly. He's not the man you can change. He's the man who helps you become more fully yourself. He's not the exception you have to win. He's the conscious choice who wins you through his consistent presence and genuine love. This kind of love exists, but finding it requires becoming the kind of woman who can recognize and receive it. It requires healing the wounds that make chaos feel like home, developing the self-worth that no longer needs external validation to feel complete, and building the internal security that can appreciate someone else's emotional availability. The journey to healthy love begins with becoming healthy yourself, and that journey, while challenging, is the most worthwhile work any woman can do.